Lynn.
Hi, Joe.
So I'm here again with my friend Lynn Rogers, who is a psychotherapist, PhD, MFT, an ordained interfaith chaplain, and a life coach. And we were having a conversation the other day, and something that Lynn shared, an aha moment of hers, really surprised me. We were talking about grief and loss. And Lynn, tell us about your new insight, and then I'll tell you why it surprised me.
Well, I was thinking that I wanted to do one of these talks with you about grief and loss. And as someone who works with so many people with life-altering illnesses, when I thought about grief and loss, the first thing that came to me was, of course, death. It was, of course, people who had died, people who are dying, people worried about dying from the coronavirus, the whole thing. And as I sat and thought about it some, I was thinking that any change in our lives means loss. Any time, even if it's the most positive change, it means letting go of something to go to something else. And sometimes there's something to grieve about that. Sometimes maybe not. And it occurred to me sometimes it happens really much later. And what I had said to you earlier was growing up, I grew up in Florida. And in my very early years, we lived in a community where we knew each other's neighbors got together, kids played with each other, there was no fear of danger. And when I left Florida, when we moved from there, and for the rest of my life, I have never had that sense of community. And I hadn't realized how much that loss of place has meant in my life. And I realized that that was another kind of grieving.
Yeah, I totally agree. I worked for some years as a grief counselor with my local suicide prevention organization, and I also led bereavement groups for parents who had suffered infant loss, neonatal loss, or miscarriages. And what I discovered at that point is that grief is grief, and any unresolved grief gets re-triggered with any loss. So, and also the point that you made about sometimes it comes later. Often we would see people come in for grief counseling around month 4 or 5, especially after a death, because initially there's a lot of support, hopefully. Not everyone has that, but hopefully most of us do. People show up, they bring us food, they call us, and over time, as time moves on, they're done with our grief, they're done with our loss, and they move on with their lives. And it's at that point that people feel bereft, and it really begins to hit them. This is the rest of my life, and the grief is not over yet. And so what would happen is sometimes someone would come in and they lost their wallet, and they would say to me, "I can't believe it. I lost my wallet and I'm crying harder than when my brother died." But of course, it's not about the wallet.
Mm-hmm. Boy, that business of what happens later and how much later brings up another piece for me. You're so right about that. A lot of people have come into my practice, I find, a year after a death, so even longer than that, when their community, when their friends think, isn't it time for them to get back to life? And aren't they holding on too long? And in fact, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual for Therapists, suggests that after as little as 6 months, you might think about this being a prolonged grief. And it's my experience. It actually reminds me of a story that I heard about a Holocaust survivor who was asked over the years that had passed since then, how did that event sit with her now? And she described it like this. She said, when you throw a stone in the water, First, there's a huge ripple effect, and then the water settles down, and then it's smooth, but the stone still remains. That and that reminded me when I was a kid growing up and someone would die, I heard the phrase all the time, Oliver Shalom. At least that's what I thought I heard. It wasn't until years later when I understood that I had misunderstood it, and that the translation of what I was saying incorrectly was, may his name be a blessing. And it so reminds me of this notion of grief, and that as long as memories are alive, as long as we have that, the person, the place, whatever it is, gets to stay alive.
And oh, I love that story, Oliver Shalom. I'll never forget. So as has been your experience with people with chronic illness, and pertaining to your newfound insight that grief comes along with any kind of major loss, not just death, people living with chronic illness, and now those of us who are sheltering in place due to the coronavirus pandemic, very different kinds of grief can be showing up. Things like, well, if I'm not going to work and I'm not going to the gym, who am I? Loss of identity. If I can't see my friends and I can't do the volunteer work that I do, what is the purpose and meaning in life? And we begin to mourn those losses. And it can give us some compassion for those of us sheltering in place, for those who have life-altering illness and have to really let go of those pieces of things that we used to identify with as who am I, essentially. And it becomes a series of small adaptations.
Oh boy, that is so true. I'm thinking of a friend of mine whose husband had a stroke. He taught music. He was a musician. He taught high school music. He also taught at a college beginning music students, adult beginning music students. And after the stroke, of course, not only his life changed, but everybody, his wife's life changed. You know, she no longer had a partner that she could talk to about what were they going to do, when should they remortgage the house, what should they do about a trip. So much had changed there. Their relationships, you know, he was suddenly not someone who was great fun to be around because he didn't remember what he said from 1 minute to the next. And I think about how their friends changed, how new people came, old people left, and some amazingly interesting things happened. Like while he couldn't seem to read English read language beyond a third grade level, his music ability stayed. And when he went to teach at the university, at the college, he wouldn't remember where he had left off the last session, but he would ask a student, they would pick up, and everyone was delighted to be there. He became really good on his bike, and his wife had decided she wasn't about to have him be dependent, and really worked on mutual independence for both of them. So there was a tremendous amount of grief. There was not only losing his relationship, their relationship as a couple, their relationships in the community, all sorts of financial issues, and one after another. So for people with chronic illnesses, we're going to hope with COVID, this is going to go away. With chronic illnesses, the best we can hope for is how do we live the best we can with it? And I guess a question that I would ask you with your work that you've done with grief counseling is, how do we help people? What have you found that's helpful when people call you?
Listening. Letting people tell their story, sometimes over and over and over again, until they no longer need to rehearse it. And most other people aren't willing to listen again. Listening, acknowledging, yes, this sucks. It hurts. It's hard to let go. Just naming the reality. And when appropriate, sharing that in my experience, having lost an infant son, that grief isn't something that we can expect to go away, but we learn to live with it. I love the story about the stone. It's such a perfect metaphor for my experience of grief. The stone is there, but I'm very comfortable carrying that stone around now.
Mm-hmm.
There's not the same kind of sadness attached to it or kick in the gut every time I remember. Enough time has passed, enough internal work has been done, enough external support has been offered that there's still grief. Every year on the anniversary of his death, I remember, and I remember with a poignancy and a love and a sadness and even a sorrow sometimes. But it's part of my history. It's part of my life. The love is still there. The relationship, I'm still Aaron's mom. And so I would say listening and acknowledge the reality of someone's feelings. Allow them to have them without trying to make it better. This leads to a whole discussion we could have, Lynn, on another time about what are some things that are not so great to say to someone who is grieving. And some other things that might be helpful. And I would love to have that conversation.
Me too. And just one more thing that I was thinking about what you said. And if the love weren't there, the grief wouldn't be there. If you hadn't had that love, we wouldn't have that kind of grief. And I don't know that you trade the love in. No, that's
certainly not.
Yeah. So next time, maybe we try that.
Let's consider that. It's been great talking to you.
You too.
Bye,
Bye.
Lynn.